So, welcome again, guys. For today, we're going to do an introduction to Firebase. Last week, we did an introduction to Flutter. And the main reason why we're going back and forth between Flutter and Firebase because we believe that with both technology, it helps with app development, and it's why we're doing it, right? Anyone knows about Firebase? I can't see a hand, so I'll ask afterwards. For today, we're going to do the opening remarks, which is, I'm going to do that. So, welcome. Also, we're going to do the code of conduct, and we're going to do an introduction where Sean Grant will do the introduction to Firebase. So, we all know what the code of conduct is, so I don't have to read it word for word. So, we should refrain from discriminating behavior or speech, intimidation, harassment, those sort of things are unacceptable. The communities will thrive if if we are respectful to each other and courteous. Um, Everyone should treat this community associated activity and event as a place to learn from each other. Communication should be constructive, and we don't want any spam or inappropriate or insulting content to be shared here. Our speaker for today is Sean Grant. He's actually a computer science student. He's interested in software development, and what I'm seeing here for Sean is that he's exploring cross-platform app development with React, right? So let us welcome Sean to give us the introduction to Firebase. Sean, over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Can you hear me?
I'm hearing you.
Okay, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be doing an introduction to Firebase. Let me share my screen. Okay, so like I said, we'll be doing an introduction to Firebase. We'll also talk some more about what backends are and how they work. And then at the end, if we have time, I'll show you guys how to set up a Firebase project and create a login system using HTML and JavaScript. All right, before we go any further, let's try to understand some of these key concepts. So firstly, we have the front end or the client. What that is, basically just anything the user can see and interact with. So it's your user interface. So it can be an app, a website, or a game. As long as you can see it and interact with it, that's the front end. Then we have our back end, also called servers, and that's hidden from the user. And that's where we'll store all our data, media files, and perform any complex operations that you wouldn't want to do on the front end. And the front ends communicate with the back end. And we do that using what's called an API or application programming interface. And that acts as a bridge between the front and back end. And it's also like a filter to prevent any like unwanted things from entering your backend, like viruses and stuff like that. So this is the typical application structure, the front end and the back end. So the client would send some sort of message if you want to upload a file or anything like that. And the API receives that message and it determines what it should really do with it. So if you're uploading a file and the API says, okay, it's fine, it will then send that file to be stored on the database. But if, say, there's a problem with the file, there's a virus in it, it won't allow you to upload it to the database and you'll get some sort of error. So, what is Firebase? Firebase is what we call a backend as a service. It's similar to software as a service, where you would have a monthly fee and you pay a monthly fee to use the software like Spotify, Netflix, Hulu, etc. But the only difference is instead of getting access to a ready-made app, you're getting access to the tools to make your own app. So it was created by two guys, James Tamplin and Andrew Lee, and it was then acquired by Google in 2014, and they turned it into what we know now as Firebase. So Firebase reduces the complexity of creating a backend from scratch. Typically, you'd have to write your own, you have to set up your own servers and write your own APIs, which can take a long time, and it's very complex. And the more complex your backend becomes, the more likely it is that you'll write bugs into your program, and you don't want that. So with Firebase, Google is actually letting you use their servers and their resources to host your app. And this can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. On the good side, you don't need to ever worry about managing servers because Google does that for you. You also don't need to worry too much about the speed of your app because Google has data centers all over the world that can serve your app in seconds. It's no matter where you are. So if somebody all the way in Japan is using your app, it would take them the same amount of time to load as it would for us. On the bad side, you lose a lot of the technical control you'd have over how your app works. So with Firebase, you can't really dig into the code and change things to the way you want. So you're basically stuck with whatever limitations the platform has. In addition to that, if you use a platform like Firebase, you don't really own your app. Because if Google decides it wants to shut down Firebase one day, you just have to sit back and watch all your hard work burn to the ground. Or for some reason, if Google decides it doesn't approve of the type of app you're making, they have the right to shut it down at any time. So those are some of the things you need to consider when using a backend as a service. But for us as students, it doesn't really matter. We just want to build our portfolio and make cool stuff. So we don't need to concern ourselves with that. So originally, I said you have to pay to use Firebase, but that's not completely true because Firebase has a generous free tier, like very generous. So you wouldn't ever need to spend money unless you exceed what the free tier offers. That or you need to use some features that the free tier doesn't cover. But in reality, you probably won't spend any real money until your app is finished and has a lot of users. So you don't have to worry about expenses. Firebase splits all the common backend features into services or modules. So things like user authentication, which we'll look at later on, database administration, file storage, all of that is split into their own separate modules, and you can enable them as you please. So if you have an app and you just need to upload an MP3 file with the app, the only thing you need from Firebase is their storage module, and you can ignore everything else. So this is the typical Firebase application structure. So as you can see, most of the server-side stuff is actually handled by Google. And instead of writing our own APIs, we're actually given an SDK, a software development kit, which is just a set of tools that allow our client to communicate with the Firebase backend. All right, so now let's look at some of those services I was talking about. First, we have authentication that just allows you to create and log in users using different providers. So if you've ever been to a website and you see options like log in with Google, log in with Facebook, stuff like that. Chances are they're probably using Firebase to handle all of that. Next, we have real-time database. And this is a efficient, low latency database that updates on all clients within seconds. So think about like on Instagram, if you like a picture, the like count would increase almost instantly. Next, you have Cloud Firestore, which is the same thing as the real-time database, but much faster, and it's just better overall. So whenever you're creating an app, this is the one you want to use, unless you have a specific reason to use the real-time database. Then we have cloud storage, and this is where you store and retrieve user-generated files like images, audio, video, PDFs, anything. Then we have hosting. This is how you'd like deploy your websites to the internet, and it will be accessible anywhere in the world. And it's also free, just like most of these. Then we have cloud functions that allows you to create and run custom backend code. So let's say you wanted to send an email every time a user uploads a file. You'd use a cloud function to actually monitor your database and then send out an email every time a new file is added. Then you have machine learning, which allows you to solve common problems in your app with artificial intelligence. Then lastly, we have cloud messaging, which basically just allows you to send notifications to different users. Yeah. So Firebase works on basically every platform: Android, iOS, web, and Unity 3D. Unity 3D is for video games, so it works across all of these. So one of the good things about using Firebase is that it can easily integrate other services into your apps, especially the ones that are owned by Google. So if you wanted to, for example, monetize your app, you could connect AdMob. Or if you put your app on Play Store, you can monitor how many downloads you get and figure out any issues that your users might be having from inside Firebase. If you do like an analytics course, you probably know what Data Studio and Marketing Platform is. And another thing to note is that Firebase and Google Cloud are connected by default. So anytime you create a Firebase project, you're actually creating a Google Cloud project under the hood. And we're going to learn some more about that in our future sessions. But for now, you can just think of Firebase as an extension of Google Cloud. And here we have some companies that use Firebase as their backend, or at least in some capacity. I have companies like New York Times, Duolingo, Lyft, Venmo, Trivago, Wattpad, Gameloft, and many others. Okay. So that's basically the end of this part of the presentation before we go on to the demonstration. So if you guys have any questions about anything I just said, you can just send it in the chat and I'll try to answer them. Any questions? Okay, guess not. Okay, so, okay. All right, so we'll move on to the demonstration. All All right, so now I'm going to show you guys how to create a login and logout system using Firebase. And we'll be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'm going to assume most of you have some basic knowledge about HTML. And if you're doing the web programming course, sorry about the noise. If you're doing web programming, you probably know about JavaScript too. So let's do that. Okay, so the Firebase console. Whenever we're creating a new Firebase project, we have to do it using the Firebase console. And that's just their website that lets you manage all of your projects and all of that. And the only prerequisite to using Firebase is that you must have a Google account, but most of you probably already do. So let's get into it. Share the rest of my screen. All right, and if you guys have any questions while I'm doing the demonstration, you can just unmute or send something in the chat. So we're going to go to the Firebase console, which is console.firebase. Okay, so whenever you go to the Firebase console, you should see a page like this. It would show all the apps you have, but this is a new account. We don't have anything yet. So I'm going to click Create a Project. We're going to give it a name. Let's see. Call it Authentication Demo. Accept terms and conditions, continue. We can turn this off. Then create the project. Just sit back and wait until this finishes. Okay, so it's finished creating our project. Now we can continue. So this is the Firebase console. This is where you manage all the different sections. If you look at the side, if you look at the side here, you'll see all the services I was talking about: authentication, Firestore, real-time database, etc. So now we want to create our app, and we're using HTML and JavaScript. So we're going to click Web right here. It's going to ask us to give it a name. You can just call it site or register your app. Okay, so now it's going to tell us how to actually connect our app to Firebase. So we're not using NPM. So click the second option to use a script tag. So what we're going to do is just copy all of this code that they give us and click continue to console. All right, so now that we have that set up, we can go to our desktop. I'm going to create a folder to actually write the code in. Let's call it auth demo. I'm going to open it with Visual Studio. All right, so create an index.html file. All right, so now we can just paste the script tag that they gave us right here. So we just quickly explain what this is doing. All right, so this line right here, we're basically including the Firebase JavaScript into our own website. So we're saying import and initialize app is a function from inside this file. So this is actually code that was written by the people at Firebase. So you can even copy the link right here. And you can see it's an actual JavaScript file. So back to our code. So yeah, this is just grabbing this function from this file. So import initialize app from, and then the name of the file. And here, this part right here, you don't really need to worry about it too much. It's just telling Firebase how to communicate with our app and how to identify which app this is. All right. So to make things a bit more neater, I'm going to copy all of this. I'm actually going to put it in its own JavaScript file. Script. Yes. And I'm going to include it right here. All right, so we have Firebase included in our project now. So now all that we have to do is we need to start designing our front end. So again, I'm assuming most of you know some HTML. So I'm going to create a div, title, Firebase, login, table, email, need an input to get the text from the user, set the type to email, ID, let's copy this. PWD input. All right, so we have these two. Let's actually try and view it. All right, so there we have a login form. It's very basic. And now we can actually just make it look a little bit better. All right, first we need two buttons. One to sign up, and another one to sign in. To give it an ID. Sign up. Sign in. So we can go back to our website now and look at it. Still looks terrible. So change it up some more. Another break. Okay. That looks bit better. All right, so now we have a basic login form. So what's going to happen is we're going to set up so that the user types in their email and password, and then they can sign up, which will create their account. And we're going to make it so like it brings up something that allows them to log out once they've logged in. So now we can create another section here. Let's call it login. So we need a button to allow the user to log out once they've logged in. Or sign out. So by default, we're going to want to hide this section and only show it once a user is logged in. So to do that, we do style display equals none. Okay, great. Okay, so now we have our front end completed. You can just add some basic styles to it to make it look a little bit better. Nice background color. Let's go change up how the input looks. Into All right, so now let's see how it comes out. All right, so still kind of ugly, but at least it has some color. Let's see. Okay, it's a bit better. All right, so now that we have the front end out of the way, what we need to do now is write our code to actually log a user in. So now let's go back to our JavaScript file. All right, so in order to get the functions we need to log a user in, we need to import it just like we imported this function here. Okay, so paste this in. All right, so again, let me explain what this statement does. What we're doing is we're importing these functions in here. So get auth, create user with email and password, sign in with email and password, and sign out. We're importing all of those functions from this file right here, this JavaScript file. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is to create a variable to actually store the authentication module. So I'm going to do const auth. I'm going to set it equal to this function right here, get auth. So now that we have that done, we have a reference to our authentication module. Now we can actually call the rest of these functions. Okay, so I'm going to create a function now. I'm going to call it sign up. So now inside this function, we want to create a user. So how we create a user, we do it using the create user with email and password function. So all you have to do is type it out, create user with email and password. And inside the brackets, we're going to pass this right here, the auth object that we created. So auth. Then we need to pass in the email and the password. But we don't have the email and password yet. So we need to get it from within the HTML. So how we do that, we create a variable. Let's call it email. We're going to set it equal to document.getElement by ID. If you go back to the HTML, you can see we set the ID right here. It's email input. So put email input. So now we have a reference to this input form from the HTML. Now we need another one for the password. Password is equal to, we set it to pwd input. Now that we have that set up, we can pass in these two. So email, and if we want to get the value that the user typed in, so we do email.value, then and password value. So we could leave it at that and it would create a user, but let's say we had an error or something happened and the user could not be created, right? So we're going to actually need to differentiate between whenever it was successful and whether it was not. So to do that, we just add to the end of it here, we're going to say .then. So then, so inside the then, it's just a function that would get called once a user was created. So if this function here, create user with email and password, if that was successful, then whatever is inside these brackets for the then would be called. So I'm going to create a function here. And the function that goes in here doesn't need a name. You just call it by this way, this function. So now the code in here will run if a user was successfully created. So if a user was successfully created, we just want to alert the user. Okay, alert user created and signed in. Right, so we have that done. We can also enable our login button that we created, right? Or sorry, logout button that we created right here. So to do that, we need to get it from the HTML. So document get element by ID. So actually just enable this entire section right here. So copy the ID. We're going to set its display to be visible. So display equals up. All right, so we have that out of the way. So now, if something bad happened and user could not be created, say you don't have a good internet connection, you want to alert the user as well. So to do that, we just add a catch, and it takes another function. Inside this function, get an error. So this would run if there's an error. An alert. User cannot be created. All right, so we have our function finished now. So if we go back, we can type in our email and password. But if you notice, when we click the buttons, nothing actually happens because we need to actually assign the buttons to fire these functions when it gets clicked. To do that, we do document get element by ID and the ID of the button. So sign up. We want to set its on click to the name of our function, which is sign in or sign up. So now, if we click this button, you get an error. User cannot be created. So let's actually try it with an email and a password. Right? Still get an error. That's because we have not enabled it within Firebase. So go back to the Firebase tab here, go under the Authentication section. Want to click Get Started. So it gives you a bunch of options as to how you want to use this to sign in. But for this demonstration, we're just going to click Email and Password, click Enable, and Save. So now we have email and password sign-in enabled. If you go under this tab right here, this would show you a list of all the users that you have. We don't have any yet, so we're going to create one now. So go back to this, can reload. So type in my email, give it a password, click sign up. There you have it, user created and signed in. Click OK, and you can see this section pops up now that we're logged in. And if we go back to Firebase, reload this, or just refresh here, you can see the user that we just created. So my email, the date it was created, and we also get a user ID. So that's like a primary key if you do access and stuff like that. So you can use the user ID in your database. So now, all right, so now that we're logged in, we need to actually come up with a way to log out. So I'm going to go back to our code, create another function. Let's log out. Now to log out, all we have to do is call the function right here. So the sign out function. Sign out, and it takes the auth object. So if the user was successfully signed out, we want to do a then function. And we can just copy this. So user logged out. So we're going to make the login button, the logout button disappear. We have our function created, that's it. So we just need to connect this function to our button. So we come back here, document dot get element by ID. So it's sign out. We're going to set its on click to logout. So now we'll go back to our website. So let's log in. Oh, wait, I have to use a different email. So user signed in. Now our logout section pops up. So we can click it, user logged out, and that section now disappears. Right. So refresh over here, you can see the two users that were created. They all have unique IDs. So now we have login or sign up and sign out working. But what if you already have an account and you want to sign into that account? So that's what this button is for. So we need to create the function to sign in a user once they've already created an account. So create another function, sign in. So just like before, we're going to call the function here, sign in with email and password. I'm going to pass the auth module and email and password. And we want a then. So if the user was successfully signed in, we want to run this function. So alert user signed in, and you want to show the logout button. And we can just copy the catch section here. Right, so that's, or well, not created, but user not logged in, sign in. So now we have our sign-in function created. So all we have to do now is just connect it to the button and just copy this. Instead of sign out, we change it to sign in and change the function to sign. So now we go back to our project. We can let's create, or no, I already have an account, so I'll use the email and password that I just created. Click sign in. We have it, user signed in, and the logout button appears. I can log out, and it says I'm logged out. Can log in again. So yeah, now it's basically complete. In reality, when your user signs in, you probably want to direct them to a different page, but for our purposes, we're just showing it right here. So if you go into the developer tools here, you can actually look and see that a user is signed in. So under session storage, is it? Okay, yeah. Here you can actually see that a user was logged in and shows you the keys and stuff. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it actually shows you the email that I used to log in right here. So this is just how the local system will know that a user is logged in. If we go to Firebase now, the two accounts are still there. And yeah, that's basically it. So we have a fully functioning login and logout system.